that model is highly debated, and I'm not presenting just that model. It's a simplification. You have, generally speaking, you have people like Ken Wilber who put it more in a hierarchical model. You have people like Washburn who put it more in a circular model, and more you have, and I'm going to get into it a little bit later, but what's called a participatory model. Tarnas being one of the main proponents of that model. And more you have those theorists all coming together and kind of agreeing on some things. And I'll move towards that. And it has implications towards therapy. With regard to therapeutic approach, as far as CBT, for example, versus again, there's so many different words that get used. I know everyone here has a little different language, so I tend to throw out 5 or 6 different words for every time I'm going to use a word, trying to speak to all of it. But so generally speaking, we've got the generally speaking, you've got body and you've got mind. You've got generally speaking, the body is unconscious, the mind is the ego or waking conscious. And you have this relationship between the two, right? And so in general, cognitive approaches are about what's going on in the mind. What are the thoughts? What are the existing structures? What are the narratives? What are the belief systems? And working at that level. And we all know that all of us have stuff going on, issues happening, where an intervention at the mind level or at the cognitive level isn't going to touch that deeper stuff. Whether you want to call that body or generally speaking, depth work or structural work is about basically what's underneath the surface. And so psychotherapeutic approaches that get at that stuff are primarily the work I'm interested in, the work I practice, and the work that I'm going to be speaking about. And again, this idea of differential diagnosis, where depending on what you're working with, as far as symptom and even moment to moment, we always have to be gauging what kind of intervention is hitting the spot versus just bouncing off a cognitive defense, right, that's happening with the client. And the deeper you go, or the more into body, or the more into unconscious, the more into structural work, the more dicey it gets, right? The more confusing, the more it gets into territory that becomes less clear between therapist and client, and so you get into what's called transference work, right? And our job, if we're doing that kind of work as therapists, is to try to consciously navigate this kind of transferential stuff that's happening, right? It's to allow it to happen, and then to try to navigate it with the client, which is not a very exact science. The general idea, obviously, is that it's not some dangerous technique that only a therapist is trying out. The general idea is that it's what happens in relationship always, right? We're all doing structural, unconscious, transferential work if we're relating with anyone ever, even if we're ordering a coffee real quick at the coffee shop. There's some stuff going on, person to person always. And obviously what we as therapists do that's different than non-therapists is we're looking at that. We're trying to look directly at that and consciously navigate that to some degree. I'm going to do questions at the end, so but I want to say that if there are clarifications that people are wanting me to make as I go along, you just feel free to speak up, because I know I'm just sort of making statements and then moving forward. So feel free to ask for clarifications, but then I'll go deeper into questions at the end. So is everybody kind of with me so far?
So you mean that I'm always projecting my mom onto every barista I meet and wanting to return to her womb?
Yes.
That's what's going on.
Yep.
That's why they get so creeped out.
Right.
Okay, so if we take as a given that we're talking that cognitive therapy, I'm not invalidating it, but I'm saying, okay, if the work I'm talking about is more on the emotional, structural, transferential, unconscious kind of work. Well, one of the points I wanted to make is that whether you think someone's having an experience that is pre-personal or transpersonal, psychotic or spiritual, et cetera, the same basic relational interaction applies. There's an exchange of energy, there's merging, there's transference, there's getting lost, there's trying to figure out what is subject, there's trying to figure out what is self and what is other, and it gets into the same sort of dicey territory transpersonal stuff does, that pre-personal stuff does, right? The general idea in consciousness studies is that the personal level or zone of consciousness where we feel stable, we have a stable sense of self, we can have stable relationships, and we feel like we have a stable place in society. It's based on the holding to these rigid parameters, right? So the very nature of it is we have to maintain our consciousness in a certain zone to achieve those things. So there's this paradox happening where we all want growth, we all want spirituality, we all want to dive into depth work, and at the same time it's dicey because it specifically involves undoing structures that were keeping you in that nice safe zone. So it's one of the reasons, obviously, I think that the field in general has moved more and more towards nice safe cognitive work and less depth transferential work. Obviously insurance companies can navigate that better as far as specific diagnoses and treatment plans, and just in general, it takes a more complex, complicated interaction to do the depth work than it does to stay in a nice safe zone. So if we say that both pre-personal and transpersonal work, states of consciousness, involve disorganization, meaning disorganized relative to that personal or organized zone. We as therapists hit that situation where, okay, a client comes in and we're trying to figure out what's going on, right? And what are they talking about? Where are they at? How can we meet them? And how can we respond to what they're talking about, right? If they come in and they say that, that they are feeling sad about something that happened in their personal life, well, that's easy. It makes sense, and we can try to empathize and hold space and meet them in that experience. If they come in and regress into a state where they literally think that they're an infant, and they're babbling like an infant and behaving like an infant, and you can tell that they are not in touch with their adult self right now, okay, that's a different story, right? And it'd be easy to say, okay, this is psychosis, and then the question is, what do you do with that, right? And do you just label it psychosis and refer them, to a psychiatrist? Do you send them to the hospital? And or is there some way to meet them in that experience that can maybe bring them back in touch with the personal zone. I'm just going to use the word personal zone for that cognitive, rational, stable, what we call consensual reality zone. Obviously, just telling them that they're being ridiculous or that they're being psychotic doesn't bring them back up into the personal zone. And it doesn't matter how correct you might be about that, right? The client doesn't care if you're accurate in your diagnosis of that they're splitting or that they're in a regress state or that they're being psychotic. And but the client is in desperate need of help, right? And we have this situation again where there's not much in between outpatient therapy and the psych ward, right? There just isn't that much out there. People are desperate. I mean, it's so common, and I'm sure you've had the same thing where, you know, for example, often when someone's in a real disorganized state, so much so that they can't even make the phone call, there'll be a spouse or a parent, you know, that will call and are desperate to get help, and it's like the only really, you know, options they can find are therapists and psych ward, and it's really an unfortunate situation that we don't have therapists that are trained. There aren't enough therapists trained in working with it, and there's not enough, you know, services that are in that middle ground is my sense. Same goes with, you know, with several other things. Suicide's another one. People that are in suicidal states, you know, it's great, come in once a week, you know, for an hour. It's just not enough, but straight to the psych ward is either overkill and or unhelpful. And so we have this terrible situation where we as therapists, it can be really, it can feel really bad to send a client out the door just saying, you know, you need more than I can do for you, you need more than outpatient treatment. But you know, I've often had the sense that I'm sending them out the door into this wasteland where they're not going to get any help. I'm basically just telling them I can't help them. The other option is to go ahead and try to help them and feel like, you know, I'm in over my head, or feel like what I'm doing is not enough, but at least it's better than if they're getting nothing. And so a lot of times I found myself in that situation where clients are coming in and it's just obvious that the treatment model of once a week, or even if it's 2 or 3 times a week, that it's really not, it really doesn't meet the need. Okay, so if you are going to see someone in that kind of state, and if I first speak to therapeutic approaches that do not involve transpersonal states of consciousness, meaning that the therapist is not doing what would be called spiritual therapy or transpersonal therapy, but just what's considered, you know, Western psychotherapy with a client. If the client is in this regress state, to go back to that example, you know, we all know that if a client goes into a state where they're experiencing themselves as this crying infant, it's only therapeutic if they bring some integration between that part of their psyche and the part of their psyche that is functional together, right? It's the connection between those two that's important. To simply jump states can be fun or it can be terrifying, but it's the integration that's important, right? The integration of these different aspects of the psyche. And so when you look at it from that perspective, that the integration is what it's about, it doesn't matter if the state that they're in seems psychotic, or if it seems spiritual, or if it seems like it makes sense, or it doesn't. You can still interact in a way that moves towards stabilization, that moves towards integration. You don't have to invalidate the person's experience, right? And that was again, one of the basic tenets, of psychoanalysis and Freud's idea that, if you just let the client free associate, as trust and intimacy increase, regression is gonna happen and all this weird twisted stuff is gonna come out, and the idea is that that's what's in there and that's what's in everybody, and that it actually surfacing and getting held space for and not judged, and not necessarily, this idea of it's validated, which doesn't mean it's true or accurate. It means that it's valid or it's okay or it's allowed to have that thought, to have that feeling, to have that experience, right? So to validate our client's experience, and to have that kind of validation, there's a real art to how do I validate without condoning, how do I validate without, suggesting that they should go ahead and behave, that kind of idea that they're having, but at the same time, especially people in states of